Welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Robert Chiu. Is there potential for an improvement in U.S.-China relations, and could this potentially alleviate China's economic challenges? Regarding the U.S. ban on Chinese semiconductors, might we be approaching a pivotal moment? Joining us today are Marco Mezger, Neumonda Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, and Peter Kurz, Quantum International Corporation Chief Strategy Officer. A very warm welcome to both on the show. Okay. China's economy faces challenges: retail sales below pre-pandemic levels, stagnant housing prices, rising household debts, and sluggish private sector investment growth. It's expected at 4.4% in 2024, down from the earlier 4.8% forecast. What does this signify for China's economic outlook? So I think the first question will go to Peter. Would you kind of give us an overview of the Chinese economy right now?
Sure. I think it's helpful to take an even broader perspective and look at what's been driving the Chinese economy up until now, and really was beginning in 2002 with China's entry into WTO that sparked that really hypercharged growth that we've seen out of China, obviously driven primarily by exports. That began to play itself out by about 10 years later. So by 2010 or so, China began moving a new mode of growth through heavy reliance on debt-financed capital spending. And that continued that growth pattern up until just the last few years, obviously up until the COVID period. And that investment was initially in badly needed infrastructure, but at some point that was more or less put in place, and then it sort of moved into housing. And of course we know now that that's also gone about as far as it can in this particular cycle. And so for all the major sort of drivers we see for China, it's pretty much run its course, and we cannot expect that China is going to be able to maintain that level of momentum going forward. So a 4% growth, 3% growth type of a pattern, I think would still be, quite respectable under those circumstances. And if we look at what Japan did for the past 30 years, beginning from a similar space or a similar situation as well, their growth was even lower. So again, I think we should be happy with that 3 to 5% range that we're probably going to see for some years to come.
So do you think that's going to be even lower than 3% in the, say, next 5 years because of this, like what I mentioned in the opener, the housing prices being kind of as a bubble a bit? What's your prediction of China's?
Well, this is not the first housing bubble or problem that we've seen out of China. 2015 was another period, and they did manage to sort of grow out of that. But that was also a period where similarly we saw U.S. begin to move away from QE to QT, to quantitative tightening, and thus tightening monetary conditions. And that put a lot of pressure on the renminbi, which began falling, and that pressured a lot of the economies in the region as well. And so, again, we're seeing similar situations there. And so, yes, I mean, it would seem to play out that we would see further weakness coming into 2024 as well, which we would expect, again, out of the U.S., out of the rest of the world, but also out of China.
Cool. Marco, so are you similarly optimistic about this 3% percentage growth rate in China?
Yeah, still? I agree with Peter. I think it's already still a pretty good result if they can maintain this kind of level of growth on the GDP, comparing from history like in Japan. But I think in the current housing crisis, what we see is China was also using basically the income from the housing market, from the land selling, to do industrial policy, right? So they're investing the money, what they had basically done from the real estate, to go into certain businesses and industry sectors.
But before that, I still want to kind of delve into what industry now is sort of like a feeble, weak in China. Housing, right?
Yes.
And also you talk about real estate industry. What else, as you observe, that might be problematic in economic sectors in China?
Well, I think it's also, I think, the luxury fashion, right? I think people are looking to hold their money a little bit together, so they feel, okay, the economy is not thriving as much as before. But that's also like, for example, in the Western countries, when you have this kind of situation. I mean, look, I'm from Germany. We would be happy if we have at the moment 5% growth rate on the GDP, right? So I think, to Peter's point, what he said, it's still a good level for China, just much less than before.
Right, automobiles, imported automobiles, for example, Mercedes-Benz.
Yes.
As you observe, any kind of decrease in amount of the automobile sale in China?
Well, I think we see a change at the moment. It's like before China was importing a lot of the cars, especially like premium luxury cars, but they have been growing up to a remarkable player in terms of the new energy vehicles, right? Electric EV cars. So I think they are going there into a position of strength and exporting more instead of basically importing, threatening also, for example, like the European, especially the German car manufacturers, to go overseas.
Okay, well, just kind of follow you to logic. Actually, Citibank raised China's 2023 growth forecast from 4.7% to 5%. They see stabilizing indicators and effective market saving measures, what promising aspects and potential rebound can be expected in China's future economy. This is kind of from the other hand to see the same scenario. Peter?
You know, we got a little bit over zealous in predicting the demise of the Chinese economy. In fact, again, it's facing challenges, but it's still a very deep economy. It's not going to see that kind of volatility as I mentioned. That said, it's, I think, inappropriate for China to be so reliant on exports, given the size of its economy. It should have a much more domestic economy, more domestic consumption, and there's structural problems preventing that from happening. And so this will be, I think, more of a structural headwind than it will be a cyclical one.
Peter, you actually mentioned from 2000 till roughly 2010, China relies on exports largely, and then relies on debts, right, for building up infrastructure. So this is sort of like philosophical. Do you think that China's economy, if it has to choose between the two paths, exports connecting to the world, or maybe just rely on the domestic supply and demand? Which side you think China can be stronger if it want to choose one path?
Well, an economy, again, of the scale of China, and now at the level of sophistication and advancement of the economy, should definitely be relying more and more on domestic consumption. One of the structural problems I refer to is just the tax structure. The Chinese consumer bears a big brunt of the tax burden in China. Roughly 40% of total tax revenues are from consumption taxes versus 15% in the United States. That needs to change, and yet there are so many vested interests in sort of keeping the export engine moving along that it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, that's good. Marco, so if Peter is right, what about the increase in the consumer confidence in China? Now it's pretty severe that, number one is it still severe or not as severe as we expected? Or if we want to rescue it, I mean, if we as a Chinese government want to rescue it, how to do that?
No, I agree with Peter. I think they need to look for the domestic market, because in exports, there are more risks, which might be applied for bans, export restrictions, sanctions, where they basically cannot rely on. But a stimulus internally, like putting lower tax on consumers, could definitely help to drive the economy. It's still 1.4 billion people living there. So if they are able to activate that the money flows into the system, this definitely can help them.
Okay, let's now kind of make the picture broader a bit. Actually, President Biden protectionist policies, if not as protectionist as Trump, have impacted China and Southeast Asia. Electronics and machinery exports from these countries have decreased. The GDP growth forecast for East Asia and the Pacific, excluding China, not in the picture, is 4.7% in 2024. To what extent are U.S. policies respond for this? Peter?
Well, certainly I first of all would leave much of this discussion to Marco to discuss, but I would just simply say that I think the U.S. is taking an approach, and it was well articulated by the U.S. ambassador to Tokyo, Rahm Emanuel, that the U.S. is now going to be forced to pay what he called a predictability premium on their imports of electronics and other goods. In other words, that they don't want to be totally reliant on one country. Obviously, China to be the source of so many particularly strategically important goods. And as that supply chain gets disseminated around the world, there will be higher costs involved. But there will be less risk that there will be any one bottleneck along the way at some point.
Maybe in the long run it's better, maybe not in the short run, higher cost. In the long run, because the eggs are not, all collected in the same basket. Maybe it's better. You agree with this kind of notion?
Well, I think you can't argue with the logic. On the other hand, there is still no more efficient place in the world to manufacture anything than China. The infrastructure there we just talked about is well established. It's got a huge contiguous geography, whereas if you try to go to, say, Southeast Asia, you're going to, as you ship goods from one sort of point of the supply chain to another, you're probably passing through different customs areas and languages and regulations and so forth. So it's still a very highly efficient place to manufacture.
So what about India? I mean, they got smart people out there, intelligent, engineers, and relative democratic system. What would be your evaluation of change to India?
I can only reflect the feedback I've gotten from industrialists that I've talked to here in Taiwan, who basically say, when you go to China and the local government official says, you can use this plot of land to build your factory, the next day, or the next week in any case, it's completely cleared out and ready to go. India, you got to come back the next year or maybe the year after that to get to that level of efficiency.
Okay, Marco, so what about your perspective about the United States now try to avoid, put all the eggs in the same basket, which is China, and diverting the resources and also investment in other countries? East Asia, Southeast Asia, you think the strategy is on the right track to the economy of the United States?
Right. I mean, it's not only to the economy of the United States, it's, I think, for everybody in the supply chain, right? You don't want to have like just one center of production. I mean, think about in Asia, Japan, earthquakes, even Taiwan, earthquakes, typhoon, right? So we are in an area where you have basically a majority of the electronics or semiconductor production. But if you look for risk management, there was before not really like a +1, right? And I think that's kind of what's happening right now with a lot of companies. So they take a China +1. One of the biggest beneficiaries of this was really Southeast Asia, right? It was like Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, but also India. So you mentioned India. A couple of years ago, even when you invested in India and you were going from state to state, you had to pay some kind of a customs, right? So even within the same country. So Modi, basically, when he was there, he basically reduced this. So this is not, will not be charged anymore. But I agree with Peter, it's definitely a different culture of working, and this will need some time. From a business perspective, I think it's very good to have a more balanced supply chain. Also in Europe, I mean, TSMC go to Europe, go to USA. I think it's good for their customers because their customers sitting in this region. And so it also enables to get more integrated in regional supply chains, not only in Taiwan, not only in Asia, but going outside, going to the US and going to Europe. I think that's very vital for the industry to be more resilient, and not that you just, okay, if one city or one country shuts down, that you are not able to produce your product anymore.
Okay, you still want to kind of go to Peter for a little small follow-up, is that from American entrepreneur perspective, is the authoritarian management or the top-down or sometimes could be arbitrary kind of management in China not a problem for American industry, even the foreign industry in China, you think, or maybe the risk could be underestimated somewhat, according to your perspective?
Well, I think this is why we are looking to create a predictability premium on our supply chain, and it was mainly the COVID lockdowns that drove that issue home. And that was a result of an authoritarian style of government that just sort of shut down the whole country, and not many other countries in the world would ever take that step. As far as operating in China, though, American companies invariably use proxies, and primarily Taiwanese, but other Asian-based proxies that are better able to operate in that cultural environment there. So yes, it is a problem, and I think it's become more of a problem than it was 10 years ago, for sure. And I'm not suggesting that we should continue to rely solely on China, but it is still going to increase our costs as we try to move away from it.
Right, but everything is avoided being pushed into a extreme. Actually, President Biden appears to acknowledge the downsides of Sino-U.S. trade war and emphasized a preference for de-risking over decoupling between the U.S. and China. So what do these terms mean in this context? I know that we've been talking about this several times in different episodes, but now Peter is new to my show, first time. Would you kind of explain what de-risking versus decoupling?
It's again what I said. It's getting rid of that risk of supply chain disruption, and again, it is incurring a cost as we do so. I don't think. I mean, the whole idea of WTO and China's entry into that was to bring China into the sort of family of nations in the world, and I think that's still a goal that we all share. The fact, though, and Marco just made the point as well, is that there are other advantages besides what we've been discussing of having a more diffused infrastructure of investment facilities around the world. So you're closer to your market and you're better able to respond to changes in demand and R&D requirements in supporting that.
Okay, so Marco, what about you? The coupling versus de-risking?
Yeah, I think I like de-risking much more, right? Because I think decoupling, again, semiconductor industry, you have 700 process steps to do a chip. You have like countries involved to make equipment, chemicals, everything. So it's kind of a very, very collaborative industry. So de-risking is kind of what I mentioned also, like the +1. So you need to have backup solution. And I think before people were not forced to look so much into other solutions, right, to find backups. And so in this sense, I think de-risking is like you still are able to doing the trade because, for example, semiconductor industry is almost 50% of the global semiconductors are used basically or produced in China. So you cannot let this market just say decouple, so we are not interested anymore. Right. So you need to find a way and a mode where you're still doing this and also get supply, but you need to have a backup plan, a risk plan.
Could you name one or two items that the Western world and China still have connection whatsoever, regardless of the ban, regarding the merchandise or imported items from both sides?
Well, what is very important, all the Western countries driving their renewable energy agenda. So if you think about solar technology, I think
solar.
It's 80 to 90%, which is coming there. Also battery technology, the majority comes from China. It will be very vital for car manufacturers around the world to be able to get access on this. And on the other side, for semiconductor equipment, yes, there are some bans on semiconductor equipment, which are basically implicated by the United States. But there are still semiconductor equipment which still can be sold after above a certain process node, where still business is done with China. So I think it's really there are so many dependencies where it's not so easy to say, okay, we stop completely the trade. We need to be smart, we need to understand to protect ourselves so that nothing happens again like with the supply chain when it was during COVID. And there I also agree with Peter, the biggest challenge was not really the sanctions which have been applied to the USA, to China. It's more like how they have disrupted global supply chain when there was COVID, where suddenly they are shutting down.
Right, yeah.
The West is not used to this. We have to supply the products to the customer, and it was very, very unheard of. And I think that's when a lot of the big corporation started to think, oh, wait a moment, all eggs in one basket. we need to find solution. And that's why Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, India, they suddenly come on the map big time, where before they were always like, there's no infrastructure, but now it works. And that's the premium, what you mentioned before. People need to be willing to pay a premium for this kind of more stability, let's put it this way.
Okay, let's together look at the different commercial assessment. Some people would argue that economic containment of China could be debated for its utility, but it might harm the U.S. economy from U.S. perspective. According to Marco Kolenovic of JP Morgan, if interest rates stay as they are, the U.S. may face recession, even stagflation with a 7% interest rate. This is kind of backfire on the U.S. So what's your argument about this argument? You think it makes sense to you?
Well, look, I think we talk about the buildup of debt in China, which is at levels that the World Bank normally assesses very high risk to for any economy. Well, guess what? It's the same level of risk in Japan, in U.S. and in Europe. All countries have been relying a lot on debt to fuel growth, maybe not quite to the extent of China, but it is, I think, behind some of the problems that we're seeing in the financial markets with higher interest rates and higher inflation. And until those debt levels come down relative to GDP, that we're going to see the economies running kind of hot. And that will actually in itself help resolve the problem. In other words, inflation, ironically, is the result of this debt overhang. It's also the solution to it, because over time that inflation will be boosting nominal GDP growth, whereas the debt numbers won't be affected. And this, I think, means that we probably will almost want to have a certain degree of inflation, something on the order of about 3%, which is where we're approaching now. But I personally don't see the need for 7% dominant interest rate levels, but they will be remaining at high levels. And the other point I want to make, though, is that we haven't really seen the negative impact of these high interest rates on the economy for two reasons. One, we've had so much cash injected as a result of the previous COVID period. But secondly, because we haven't had the refinancings hitting yet, and they begin to hit in 2024 and even more in 2025. That is to say, a lot of corporate and government debt that is going to come due in these years that will have to refinance at higher interest rates.
Okay, now they kind of shift the gear a bit and talking about semiconductors. So as we mentioned times ago, is there any indication of the U.S. easing the ban on semiconductor or exports to China? If not, how does maintaining this ban align with Biden's aim for stable U.S.-China trade relations? We just talked about the decoupling is better. Actually, de-risking is better. So what's your assessment of this?
I mean, just recently, there was the first time since 2019 that Chuck Schumer, with a delegation from the USA, was visiting China again. And I think there was also talks with high-level executives from semiconductor equipment companies to speak with the Biden administration, because they see they have challenges, how they cannot leave this market completely empty, right? So they need to find a way to do business in China within restrictions. For example, NVIDIA with the AI processors, they have a special version for the China market, which is basically under the threshold what the US government gives there in order to be able to continue to sell to China. Also, Intel basically has a high interest to continue to do business there. So they try to find a way, and I think seeing delegations going to China again and talking about it, I think there's a lot going on behind the scenes, let's put it in this way. So on a side note, just also last week, there was the US government released some more guardrails for the CHIPS Act, for companies, the Korean ones like Samsung and SK Hynix. They have huge factories in China, up to 40-50% of their output for DRAM and NAND in Xi'an and Wuxi factories. So they were under a waiver until October 7 that they can still supply equipment there. But after this, normally it would run out. Now they get an indefinite extension of this waiver that they can continue to bring in new equipment to sustain and even like with a small growth, their capacity there. Because the problem would be if you cut this completely off, it has a huge effect on the global supply chain, as you can imagine. The memory market is like 20 to 30% of the semiconductor market, and it's very, very volatile. So if some of this capacity is going away, then this would have a huge impact also for American companies, international companies, that they would not be able to make the products anymore.
Was the ban you mentioned, on the Korean companies, the semiconductor manufacturing segments in China from the United States?
Yes, because they were not, if they apply for the CHIPS Act money, because they apply also for money from the US to do new factories in the USA, then it comes with some restrictions. Okay. And these restrictions now have been kind of defined. This gives some more planning security for the companies and also some better understanding that these factories, because you need to understand about these factories, they cost tens of billions of dollars. This is not an investment you make in 1 year. This is like a long-term planning. And I think the government, US government has tried to find a way that they still keep somehow the ban in, but they give some flexibility for existing capacity.
Okay, Peter, the same question to you, but could you briefly also bring the role of Taiwan in the whole picture? Semiconductor, we are strong in this, and now de-risking between US and China, what to do for Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan is obviously already doing a lot of heavy lifting already in that regard through TSMC's investments obviously in Arizona, in Germany, in Japan. And I think that in the long run, this makes sense in any case. Taiwan is a technically active island, and to put all of the highly advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity in the world here in Taiwan probably isn't the best thing for the world or for Taiwan, and certainly not for TSMC either. Again, it will incur costs, but it will also, I think, create a level of stability that will allow a greater reliance on these technologies and help fuel growth going forward. I think this will also help Taiwan become more of a actively participating member of the global economy rather than simply just exporting into the channels which are mostly controlled by foreign companies.
In this episode, we've delved into the US-China economic competition and looked for any signs of rapprochement. We also highlighted that Taiwan can't remain detached from the superpower struggle and needs to be prepared. If you like our show, please leave a comment and subscribe to Taiwan Talks. See you soon.